Chapter 1: The Night That Changed Everything. It was a dark and stormy night. John was sitting in his room, studying for an upcoming exam, when he heard a strange noise outside. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the noise persisted and grew louder. Curiosity got the better of him, and he got up from his desk to investigate. As he opened the window, he saw something that would change his life forever. A shadowy figure was creeping along the fence, making its way towards the house. John couldn't make out what it was, but he knew it was not human. Without thinking, John grabbed a flashlight and ran outside to confront the shadow. As he approached, the figure turned towards him, revealing its grotesque features. It had glowing eyes and sharp claws, and it let out a blood-curdling screech. John was frozen in fear, but he knew he had to fight. He swung his flashlight at the creature, but it only made it angrier. The creature lunged at him, and they engaged in a brutal fight. Despite being no match for the creature's strength, John refused to give up. He fought with all his might, until he was finally able to overpower the creature and vanquish it. But the cost was high. John was injured and traumatized by the experience. From that night on, John knew he was destined to become a hunter, to fight against the evil creatures that lurked in the shadows. The night had changed everything for him, and he would never be the same again. Chapter 2: Becoming a Hunter. After the traumatic encounter with the supernatural creature, John knew he could not go back to his normal life. The event had left a lasting impression on him, and he felt a strong sense of duty to protect others from the same fate. As days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, John became increasingly obsessed with the idea of hunting down creatures like the one he had encountered. He spent all his time researching, training, and preparing for his new calling. It wasn't long before John met others like him, hunters who had dedicated their lives to protecting the world from the dark forces that threatened it. They taught him everything he needed to know, from identifying different types of creatures to using various weapons and tools. John quickly realized that being a hunter was not just a job or a hobby, it was a way of life. It required discipline, sacrifice, and a willingness to risk everything to protect others. But he also felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had never experienced before. As John continued to train and hone his skills, he began to receive calls for help from people who had encountered supernatural creatures. He quickly responded, eager to put his training to the test and protect innocent lives. Each mission brought new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to grow as a hunter. John knew that he had found his true calling, and he was determined to become the best hunter he could be. Chapter 3: A Dark Presence Emerges. John had been a hunter for several years now, and he had faced all kinds of creatures, vampires, werewolves, demons, and more. But he knew that there was always a new threat lurking in the shadows, waiting to emerge and wreak havoc on the world. That new threat came in the form of a dark presence that began to spread across the city. It was unlike anything John had ever encountered before, a force of pure evil that seemed to be able to control the minds of those it touched. People began to behave strangely, committing acts of violence and terror that were completely out of character. John knew that something had to be done, and he quickly rallied his fellow hunters to investigate. As they delved deeper into the mystery, they discovered that the dark presence was emanating from a powerful artifact that had been unearthed in an archaeological dig. The artifact had been locked away for centuries, but now it had been unleashed, and its power was corrupting everything it touched. The hunters knew that they had to act fast before the dark presence consumed the entire city. They worked tirelessly to track down the artifact, and after a long and grueling battle, they were able to destroy it and banish the dark presence back to where it came from. But the battle had taken its toll. John and his fellow hunters were battered and bruised, and they knew that there would always be new enemies to face. Nevertheless, they were determined to continue their mission, to protect the world from the forces of darkness, no matter what new threats emerged. Chapter 4: Tracking the Shadow. John had been restless for days, haunted by the shadow that had been following him. He could feel it lurking in the corners of his vision, just out of reach, but always there, waiting. He knew that he had to act fast before the shadow consumed him completely. He gathered his weapons and his wits and set out to track the creature down. The hunt was long and grueling. John tracked the shadow through dark alleyways, abandoned buildings, and even into the city's sewers. He was constantly on guard, never knowing when the creature would strike. Finally, after days of tracking, John cornered the shadow in an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He drew his sword and prepared for battle. The shadow was a formidable opponent. It was fast and elusive, slipping in and out of the darkness with ease. But John was determined, and he fought with all his might. The battle was intense, with John and the shadow locked in a deadly dance. John's sword glinted in the moonlight as he struck blow after blow, driving the creature back. Finally, after what seemed like hours, John delivered the final blow. The shadow let out a howl of pain and dissolved into the darkness, leaving John panting and triumphant. As John walked away from the warehouse, he knew that the hunt was far from over. There would always be more shadows to track, more creatures to hunt. But for now, he was content, knowing that he had triumphed over his latest foe. Chapter 5: Confrontation in the Darkness. John had been tracking the shadow for weeks. He had followed it through the city streets, deep into the forest, and finally to a hidden cave deep in the mountains. The cave was dark and foreboding, with an eerie chill that ran through John's bones. He could feel the shadow's presence all around him, like a palpable force. As he made his way deeper into the cave, he noticed that the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that he couldn't decipher. He knew that he was getting closer to the shadow's lair. Finally, he reached the end of the cave, and there it was, the shadow's lair. It was a massive chamber, filled with strange artifacts and twisted sculptures. And there, in the center of it all, was the shadow itself. John drew his sword and prepared for battle. The shadow hissed and snarled, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The battle was fierce, with John and the shadow locked in a deadly dance. They circled each other, striking blow after blow, neither gaining the upper hand. But then, something strange happened. The symbols on the walls began to glow, casting an eerie light over the chamber. And suddenly, the shadow seemed to grow stronger, its attacks more vicious. John realized that he had to act fast. He reached into his bag and pulled out a vial of holy water. With a swift motion, he hurled it at the shadow. The effect was immediate. The shadow screamed in agony as the holy water burned through its dark form. And then, with a final howl, it dissolved into nothingness. As the glow faded from the walls, John realized that the fight was over. He had conquered the shadow, but at what cost? He knew that there would always be more shadows to fight, more battles to win. But for now, he was content in the knowledge that he had prevailed over the darkness once again. Chapter 6: A Hunter's Worst Nightmare. John had always trusted his fellow hunters, relying on them to have his back in the fight against evil. But that all changed when he received a letter from a hunter he had considered a friend. The letter was short and to the point, accusing John of crimes he had never committed. It claimed that John had been working with the very creatures he had sworn to destroy, and that he was no longer to be trusted. John was stunned. He knew that the accusations were baseless, but he also knew that in the world of hunters, reputation was everything. If word got out that he was a traitor, he would be shunned by his peers and hunted by his enemies. Determined to clear his name, John set out to find out who had written the letter. He traced it back to a hunter named Marcus, someone he had fought alongside many times. When he confronted Marcus, he was met with a cold and calculating stare. Marcus admitted to writing the letter, saying that he had seen John with one of the creatures they had been hunting, and that he had no choice but to report it. John was incredulous. He had been on a reconnaissance mission, trying to gather information on the creature's movements. Marcus had jumped to conclusions, and had put John's life and reputation in danger. Feeling betrayed, John left the Hunters' Council, knowing that he could no longer trust his fellow hunters. He decided to continue fighting evil on his own, relying on his own instincts and abilities. As he set out into the night, John knew that he would face many dangers ahead. But he was determined to prove his innocence and clear his name, no matter what it took. The betrayal had been a hard lesson, but it had also taught him to rely on himself above all others. Chapter 7: Fighting for What's Right. John had always been a man of principle. He had dedicated his life to fighting the forces of darkness and protecting innocent people from harm. But after the betrayal by one of his fellow hunters, he had lost his way. He had become disillusioned with the Hunters' Council and had left, feeling that he could no longer trust anyone. For months, John had wandered the streets alone, taking on jobs here and there to survive. But he knew that he couldn't go on like this forever. He missed the sense of purpose he had felt as a hunter, and he longed to redeem himself in the eyes of his former colleagues. One night, John stumbled upon a small town that was being terrorized by a group of vampires. The townspeople were desperate for help, but they had been turned away by the Hunters' Council, who had deemed the town too small and insignificant to warrant their attention. Without hesitating, John took on the task of hunting down the vampires himself. He spent weeks tracking them down, learning their habits and weaknesses. He also befriended the townspeople, gaining their trust and support. Finally, the night of the showdown arrived. John faced off against the vampires in the town square, using all his skills and training to defeat them. The townspeople watched in awe as John fought with a determination they had never seen before. When it was all over, the town was safe once again. The people were grateful to John, and they praised him for his bravery and skill. And even though he had acted alone, John knew that he had redeemed himself in the eyes of his fellow hunters. With renewed purpose, John set out to rejoin the Hunters' Council, determined to continue fighting for what was right. He knew that there were still many battles to be fought, but he was ready to face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that he had the strength and the skills to make a difference. Chapter 8: The Showdown. The time had come for John to face his greatest challenge yet. The shadow, the most powerful and elusive enemy he had ever faced, had finally revealed itself. John had spent months tracking the creature, following its trail of destruction through towns and cities. But now, the shadow had taken up residence in an abandoned castle on the outskirts of town. It had built up a formidable army of demons and other supernatural creatures, all of whom were fiercely loyal to the shadow. John knew that he could not face the shadow alone. He reached out to his fellow hunters, and together they formed a plan of attack. They would enter the castle under the cover of darkness and take the shadow by surprise. The hunters gathered outside the castle gates, steeling themselves for the battle to come. They knew that they would be facing incredible odds, but they also knew that they were fighting for the greater good. As they entered the castle, the hunters encountered wave after wave of demons, all of them determined to stop the hunters from reaching the shadow. But John and his comrades fought on, cutting through the horde with their weapons and their magic. Finally, they reached the inner sanctum of the castle, where the shadow waited for them. The creature was massive, with long tentacles and a face that seemed to shift and change with every passing moment. The battle was intense, with the hunters launching attack after attack on the shadow. But the creature was powerful, and it seemed to absorb their magic and their blows with ease. Just when all seemed lost, John remembered a piece of ancient lore that he had learned years before. He knew that there was one weapon that could defeat the shadow, a weapon that had been lost for centuries. With the last of his strength, John summoned the weapon to him, and he plunged it into the shadow's heart. The creature let out a terrible shriek and then crumpled to the ground, defeated. The hunters emerged from the castle, battered and bruised, but victorious. They had faced the greatest evil of their time and had emerged triumphant. And even though they knew that there would always be more battles to fight, they also knew that they had the strength and the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 9: Dealing with the Consequences. The aftermath of the epic battle between good and evil left the town in shambles. The destruction was unprecedented, and the residents were trying to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. John, the hero of the story, was hailed as a savior by the people. He had saved them from the clutches of the shadow and its minions. But the victory was not without a cost. Many lives were lost, and the wounds inflicted on the town would take years to heal. John was grappling with his own demons too. The scars left by the battle were deep, and the trauma was difficult to shake off. He was struggling to come to terms with the loss of his friends and the destruction he had witnessed. The townsfolk tried to help John in their own way. They threw a grand celebration in his honor, but John was not in the mood for festivities. He felt guilty that he had survived while many others had not. He decided to leave the town and venture out into the wilderness. He wanted to find solace in nature and come to terms with his inner turmoil. The journey was long and arduous, but John persisted. He encountered many obstacles, but he was determined to overcome them. Slowly, he began to find peace in the quiet of the wilderness. The memories of the battle still haunted him, but he learned to control his fears. He realized that he had the strength to face his demons and overcome them. After months of wandering, John returned to the town. He found that the people had rebuilt their homes and were slowly moving on with their lives. They welcomed John with open arms and thanked him for his bravery. John was grateful for their kindness, but he knew that he had a long road ahead of him. He had to learn to live with the memories of the battle and the loss of his friends. The aftermath of the battle had changed John. He was no longer the same person he had been before. He had experienced the depths of despair and had emerged stronger from it. He knew that he had a purpose in life: to fight for what was right and protect the innocent. The battle may have been won, but the war between good and evil continued. John was ready for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 10, continuing the hunter's legacy. After the final showdown with the shadow, John had thought that his life as a hunter was over. He had defeated his greatest enemy, and with that, he believed that he could finally leave the life of hunting and live a peaceful existence. But as time passed, John began to realize that he couldn't simply walk away from the calling. The world was full of darkness and evil, and he had the skills and knowledge to protect people from it. He decided to continue the legacy of the hunters and train a new generation of protectors. John opened a training academy for young hunters, where he taught them everything he had learned over the years. He worked tirelessly to ensure that they were prepared for whatever dangers they might face, and he instilled in him the same sense of duty and honor that had guided him throughout his own journey. As he watched his students grow and flourish under his guidance, John knew that he had made the right decision. He was continuing the legacy of the hunters, ensuring that the world would always have protectors against the darkness. But even as he focused on training the next generation of hunters, John knew that there would always be new threats emerging. The darkness was always lurking, waiting for its chance to strike. And when that time came, John would be ready to face it once again, armed with the knowledge, skills, and experience that had defined his life as a hunter.